And for him, this really is, I was writing about it last night, it feels like something out of The West Wing, doesn't it? The drama, the plot twists, the infighting. I mean, you couldn't make it up in terms of art imitating life, if you like, or life rather imitating art. This guy was basically down and out. You know, he'd blown it, if you like. He tried to run as Prime Minister. People always say you only really get one shot, you only get one chance to either win the members over or you don't. He's 42 years old, 7 years in Parliament, and he must have thought at the end of August into September, well, my political career is over, what do I do next? And now here we are. I can barely believe it's 7 weeks later, and he is about to become the Prime Minister. And actually, I think that perhaps what happened to him over the summer was probably quite character building for Rishi Sunak, because to go through that race and those hustings when pretty much it was nailed on, certainly from mid-August, that he was not going to win. He still had to go through the motions. His team stayed with him and they carried on right to the bitter end. He did not concede. And then, you know, the team disbanded. I mean, it's brutal, this. You know, the team, they worked so hard over the summer. He lost out to Liz Truss. They disbanded. And then suddenly they are now in power. It's quite hard really to process it. I asked some of his allies actually yesterday as they were coming into Conservative campaign headquarters to cheer him on, whether he'd been really jubilant after the vote, and they just said not really. He just knows the job at hand and the responsibility he has.
That is a difficult job indeed. We are watching Rishi Sunak on his way to that audience with the King. We could bring in our events commentator, Alistair Bruce, because Liz Truss has tendered her resignation. Rishi Sunak, you can see there, on his way. Alistair.
The King is about to appoint Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, but first of all, he will ask whether there is the possibility of leading a government. And the moment Rishi Sunak answers that question, he becomes Prime Minister. Plenty of people there at the North Centre Gate, seeing as the procession of cars comes in. It'll pass through the North Arch into the quadrangle. Number 7 Company, Coldstream Guards, forming the King's Guard today on a long guard. There's no changing of the guard ceremony today, which makes this handover of power easier. And into the quadrangle. Now, the King will receive Rishi Sunak in the 1844 room, which, as we look down at Buckingham Palace, is at the rear of the building, beyond that green roof, looking out onto the garden. The car will stop, the footman will open the door, and he will be received by, first of all, the King's Equerry, Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Thompson, and also the King's principal private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton. Also there, the former Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Young, and receiving also, welcomed to in the palace to the King's door. And Rishi Sunak will be escorted through the palace to the place where the King will receive him. That's quite a distance in terms of the corridors, and when there, the Equerry will explain precisely how the audience will take place. And it's traditional that when the King signals that he is ready, a buzzer will play, and Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Thompson will open the door and enter and introduce the Right Honourable Rishi Sunak. And then the King will be left alone, and the moment of asking that question, can you form a government, will take place. And the moment Rishi Sunak says yes, he will become the King's Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury. The tradition has it that after the initial part of the audience of the King has taken place, there will be further discussions, maybe not much time spent on this occasion. There's no farewell to be given, but a very clear amount of work to be done. So quite soon after the reception and the invitation and the moment it's taken place, the King will press the buzzer again, and Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Thompson will come to the door, and in a tradition that went all through the last Queen's reign, the equerry is the first person to say, "Congratulations, Prime Minister." So that will take place now inside Buckingham Palace as the constitutional role of the King is performed by His Majesty on behalf of the United Kingdom and his constitutional duties.
Alistair, thank you very much for all that analysis and explaining to us what is happening this morning. Rishi Sunak there arriving for his audience with the King. Moments earlier, of course, today, Liz Truss meeting with the King to tender her resignation. All we had, of course, was the short statement from the Royal Communications at Buckingham Palace. The Right Honourable Elizabeth Truss had an audience with the King this morning and tendered her resignation as Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury, which His Majesty was graciously pleased to accept. Just one short sentence, of course, but so much, of course, behind those words as King Charles meets first to accept the resignation of Liz Truss, the shortest-serving Prime Minister. She resigned after just 45 days in office, and to welcome in Rishi Sunak to approve his appointment as the youngest Prime Minister in 200 years, the first British Asian Prime Minister, and also, as we've been discussing here in Downing Street this morning, an incredible amount in his in-tray. Let's bring in our political editor, Beth Ridley, shall we, who is here with us throughout this morning. Rishi Sunak currently meeting King Charles. It has been, as you said, a real rollercoaster for him after the last leadership contest just 7 weeks ago. What are you expected to hear from him later today?
Well, I think what he's going to have to do later today is talk directly to the country, because now he's not just the leader of the Conservative Party, he's about to be the new Prime Minister. And we did get a bit of a flavour of some of the things he might talk about, because he did address the 1922 committee, he addressed backbench MPs yesterday, and he also did that very short statement in Conservative campaign headquarters, the first time we'd heard him speak, where he talked about the need for unity, and he talked about profound economic challenges that the country were facing. So I would expect more of that. What did he say to MPs last night? Well, he talked about the economic crisis and the political crisis unfolding. He told MPs that the public will hold us accountable for it unless we fix it now. He told them that they have time before the next election to do it, but he warned that there's only one shot, no second chances. He described the place of the Conservative Party as an existential moment, and I guess that feeds into the "we unite or die." So really warning that unless people get behind him, the party could actually split. He talked also about Ukraine and backing the policies of his two predecessors. And on energy, he supported Liz Truss's decisions around protecting households and that long-term energy plan. And then again, as I was saying, he talked about delivering on the 2019 manifesto. Let's see if he goes any further. I would advise him not to, given how badly that went wrong for Liz Truss. It was actually that fracking vote forced upon the Conservative Party by Labour MPs that actually on that Wednesday night became the unravelling of her amid this chaos about whether it was a whipped vote, with some MPs just refusing to vote for what was against the manifesto promises and clearly really difficult issues in their constituencies. So maybe he will decide to lean out of any of these unnecessary confrontations. So that was kind of what he spoke about last night. I am sure that he will talk really about economic plans.
And Beth, we can now see the lectern leaving number 11. A new lectern. Liz Truss had a Jenga-style lectern, wasn't it? It was quite eye-catching, shall we say, Beth. This one is a bit more traditional, perhaps trying to give a rather different look to the Liz Truss lectern. The podium is out, and it is a very different one to the one that we saw Liz Truss bring in. Everyone gets to choose their own lectern, don't they, their own podium, Beth?
They do, and as you said, you can't see it in shot, but this one is very solid and stable. Sorry, that was a bad joke. In that it's just a straight, it's like a traditional lectern. You can't see the stand, but it's just straight. And as Sophie was saying, Liz Truss had a sort of twisted, a sort of curvy twist of a lectern. So, you know, I don't know if this is a metaphor of Rishi Sunak going back to the sort of stable politics and stable economics that he certainly talked about wanting to do when he becomes Prime Minister. This is a huge moment for him. You have to think that, as I was saying 7 weeks ago, Rishi Sunak thought his political career could be over. He resigned as Boris Johnson's Chancellor. He then fought Liz Truss and lost. He was then booted out of cabinet and back on the backbenches. He's kept his counsel. We have barely seen nor heard from him for the past few weeks. And I guess the thing about this coronation rather than a contest is that we really don't know what Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister will do, given that everything he said in the run-up to becoming Prime Minister was in August, and the world has changed so much in such a short space of time due to the decisions that Liz Truss has made. So let's see what he says. I imagine it will be a big focus on economy. Let's see if he talks about tough decisions on tax and spend. Let's see if he, as he did in the leadership contest, levels with the British public the challenges ahead. It might be better for him to do that, given that we know it's going to be a very, very bumpy period.
Yeah, it certainly will, Beth. We can see a bit more of the lectern in shot there. The solid and stable podium, as Beth was just describing it. There's a single glass of water on top of it because it certainly is going to be an important speech for Rishi Sunak. He's spoken to the party so far, but really heard very little from him, as Beth was saying, during this short leadership campaign. He will be wanting to address the public later, and it'll be interesting to see if he decides to flesh out a bit more of his vision for the country when he does take to the steps. You can hear the sound test going on there as well. As we're talking, though, King Charles, of course, currently inviting Rishi Sunak to form a new government. They are in Buckingham Palace. Let's bring in our events commentator now, shall we? Alistair Bruce. Alistair.
The King is receiving the Right Honourable Rishi Sunak in the 1844 room, which looks out over the gardens of Buckingham Palace to the left of our picture down there. And it is a tradition that the King theoretically doesn't know what we all know and therefore receives politicians and wants to know the answer as to whether the new politician he's about to make Prime Minister actually can command a majority in the House of Commons, which is the key element as head of state the monarch needs to know. They're meeting, as I say, in the 1844 room, which was decorated for a visit in that year by Tsar Alexander I of Russia. And I'm sure that one of the matters upon which the King will wish to talk to his new Prime Minister is the issue that is going on in the world, and particularly in Europe, with Russia. But the responsibility of government is finally given to Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury when he says yes to the invitation from the King, can you form a government? And we know that he will say yes because we are aware from everything Beth has been telling us that Rishi Sunak can command a majority in the House of Commons. For the King, of course, it starts a relationship which will pass forward with weekly audiences here of the King at Buckingham Palace. They're always audiences of a monarch because it is the monarch who is receiving the Prime Minister as head of government and then listens, and after all, the Prime Minister acts in the King's name. The Cabinet operates the executive authority of the King. We know that kings carry out no executive functions in reality. They do it on advice. And the principal advisor, of course, will be the new Prime Minister. The title of First Lord of the Treasury, which is on the letterbox just behind the new podium, is a reminder that that was always where real authority lay, right back for kings in the times of not only soon after the conquest, but right through our history, that whoever held the treasury was principally important. And that is why the prime ministership has always walked in recent times with that. The King's standard flies, and I'm sure by now, although we'll wait for it to be confirmed by Buckingham Palace, we have a new Prime Minister.
We do have a new Prime Minister very shortly, as Alistair Bruce just saying, King Charles inviting Rishi Sunak to form a new government after that meeting with Liz Truss, where he accepted her resignation earlier this morning. Well, let's bring in Beth Rigby, shall we? I would always love to be, a fly on the wall on some of these meetings, the kind of intimate meetings between King Charles and the Prime Ministers. And it's quite remarkable, isn't it, thinking about Liz Truss meeting, of course, the Queen just before she died, and now she has met with King Charles earlier today. But things will be moving very quickly. Rishi Sunak will be travelling back here to Downing Street. He'll be giving a speech at the lectern that's just been brought out, and really a huge intro for the next Prime Minister.
Yes, and I'm picking up a little bit about, we're talking about the change of tone, the change of style. We've got a different lectern, but I've also been told that Mel Stride, one of his key lieutenants, has emailed MPs to tell them there's not going to be a throng of advisers coming out and MPs in the street as Boris Johnson and Liz Truss has done before. I'm told by someone in his team that it's just going to be Rishi Sunak, no one else in the street. Now, I don't know if his family will be there. He's got 2 young daughters. I don't know if they might stand by his side or he will come out alone. I don't know about his family. But in terms of the politics of it, it's not a big kind of celebratory show of support. It's going to be just Rishi Sunak. And I also wonder, and I don't know this, but the fact that it's Mel Stride, who was one of his organisers, emailing MPs, does that mean, and this is a guess, does that mean that Mel Stride might become his chief whip because he's very trusted by Rishi Sunak? I don't know. I can't get any confirmation from that. They're being very tight-lipped about the reshuffle. But that he has emailed MPs saying, let's not show up, this isn't a big celebration, I think speaks to the tone, the change of tone that Rishi Sunak is going to want to try and introduce when he takes up the reins at number 10.
And it'll be interesting as well, won't it, to see if his family is there. We saw, of course, Liz Truss, her husband, her 2 daughters there, and when Boris Johnson gave his resignation speech, Carrie and their children too. But, of course, Rishi Sunak has been unhappy, hasn't he, with some of the focus on his family in recent months about the tax status of his wife. We're speculating, of course, but it'll be interesting to see if he does decide to continue that tradition of having his family on the street.
Well, actually, when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, her children weren't there. Her husband was there, but her children weren't there. And when Boris Johnson left number 10, yes, Carrie came out with the baby, with Romy the baby, but the baby's tiny, so, she was carrying her in a sling. But when they left number 10, the children weren't there. And actually, Boris Johnson and Carrie Johnson definitely tried to keep their 2 young children out of the limelight. And Liz Truss, as I said, there was Frances and Liberty, her 2 teenage daughters. It's the first time I'd ever seen them. I didn't even know, actually, if they'd moved in to number 10, and I didn't ask. I didn't think it was my business. They're her children. But in terms of Rishi Sunak's family, you're right, there was a massive controversy around his wife, the fact that she was a non-dom and had therefore followed tax rules, which meant she'd avoided a lot of tax. Now, was in the rules. I asked Rishi Sunak exactly about this at the July launch, when he launched his leadership bid, that was this a problem, and he did make the point that the tax arrangements had changed. His wife is now, removed her non-dom status, and that she had answered that question for herself. And as far as he was concerned, that drew a line under the matter. But I think there's a couple of things to say on that. Number one, when that all blew up, I think it was last April or so, that his wife was a non-dom, and also that he had, which I think he is now doesn't have, but had a green card, which basically means you can move to America whenever you want. These did raise questions about whether he could therefore stand as Prime Minister. I remember at the time everyone going, oh, that's it, Rishi Sunak's career is over, he's never going to get past this with the British public. And yet now he is Prime Minister. Now, he would say he and his family have answered those questions. His wife has changed his tax arrangements. I've asked him about his privilege. He went to, I think it was Winchester. Was it Winchester?
It was Winchester, and donated to them as well,
very, very prestigious public school. I asked him about this in an interview we did actually earlier this year about who was Rishi Sunak and would this privilege be a barrier to success. His wife is the daughter of one of the richest men in India. You know, his father-in-law is a billionaire. They are multi-millionaires. His argument was, you know, his parents were pharmacists, I think, or one of his... They were in
pharmacist and GP.
A GP, that was a pharmacist and a GP. His argument was they'd saved up and worked hard to get him that education, and that he was someone that was in touch with the British people. Now, the question is, the obvious attack lines for Labour is to try and paint Rishi Sunak as a privileged person out of touch with ordinary working people. And they will be the attack lines, and Rishi Sunak and his family might have to absorb some of that. But as I said, it's curious that these things that were these sort of massive political barriers to him, in the end, it seems impossible in that moment, but actually he managed to get past that. And as I said, his wife did change her tax arrangements. There were some reports over the weekend that when Liz Truss resigned, and then this all happened so quickly, I mean, it was Thursday she resigned, and Monday we have a new Prime Minister, that he went to talk to his wife about whether or not she was prepared for him to take this office and the inevitable scrutiny that comes with it. So it might be that because of all of this, that his family want to stay behind the scenes, but we'll find out soon enough.
Yeah, and as you say, it's a huge thing for any family, of course, entering Downing Street and only seeing Liz Truss's daughters really for the first time today as she resigns as Prime Minister. Well, we're still looking at those pictures at Buckingham Palace where King Charles is inviting Rishi Sunak to form a new government. Some of the constitutional measures that always have to be gone through, of course, with the appointment of any new Prime Minister and new government. He's there in Buckingham Palace. We expect him to leave from there and come to Downing Street, where he's going to be giving a speech from the new lectern, the different lectern to the one that Liz Truss had. And really, it's his time to talk to the British people directly. He's been quite tight-lipped throughout the very truncated, very short leadership contest, but we do expect to hear a bit more from him later on today. And Beth, of course, here to pick up any intelligence that we're getting. Mel Stride, as you were saying, a key ally of Rishi Sunak, already emailing MPs. So perhaps our first clue as to who could be by his side as he does form a new government.
Well, I expected Mel Stride is the very respected chair of the Treasury Select Committee and someone that was making it pretty hard, I should say, for Liz Truss over those policies, asking her for reversals, trying to bounce her, as many other MPs did, and force in those reversals. Now, people that back Liz Truss and people that don't much like Rishi Sunak felt that his allies tried to destabilise Liz Truss from the outset, be that Michael Gove, be that Grant Shapps, who she then actually brought into cabinet, be that someone like Mel Stride. So yes, those people I would imagine all have key roles in his government, but equally don't underestimate that there is still bitter blood over the way in which Liz Truss, some of her allies would say, was never given an opportunity. Now, she didn't help herself, clearly, but there was a lot of agitating because of the policies. To be fair to the likes of Mel Stride, I mean, you know, the markets are your best poll ever, aren't they? They tell you exactly immediately what they think. And she got her answer. I remember on that day saying it might be that the biggest story here is actually how the markets react.
Yes.
And that is how it played out, because you know, those unfunded tax cuts that went beyond what she'd said, it just spooked the markets. And I did think in the run-up to her becoming Prime Minister, I thought that maybe she might keep the principles of the tax cuts but stage them in a way that brought the markets or the party around. She chose not to follow that strategy. She paid a heavy price. Rishi Sunak will have looked and learnt, and let's see what type of inclusivity he tries to bring to this government. Whether or not he can rebuild the party is an entirely different subject that we could probably spend a few hours debating. But for now, let's see about the inclusivity, let's see what he says to the country, and let's see about the changing style as well.
Yeah, we've already had some clues as to the changing style, haven't we, Beth, with the lectern, the fact that we now know that there won't be the crowds of supportive MPs and also staff members as well on the street, just Rishi Sunak giving a very serious speech, we expect, from a very serious-looking lectern as well. And Beth, you were just talking there about the inclusivity. Mel Stride, someone who, of course, has done an awful lot of legwork for Rishi Sunak over the last couple of months, but someone who's made some enemies in the process, particularly among those supporters of Liz Truss and potentially Boris Johnson as well. Are there any names that you are looking out for when he does decide to form a government? I mean, Michael Gove is someone that a few people mentioned, isn't it? That would be an extraordinary comeback, wouldn't it?
I don't think Michael Gove will be an extraordinary comeback because Michael Gove clearly set himself apart from Liz Truss. There were rumours in the parliamentary party that he had backed Kemi Badenoch precisely to try and split the right between Braverman, Truss and Badenoch in order to try and block Liz Truss or make it very difficult for her. And then he became, didn't he, the leader of the Rebel Alliance, as he was described at conference, going onto the airwaves the morning of party conference and basically publicly attacking some of Liz Truss's policies, particularly the 45p tax rate, which, you know, with 24 hours she had to reverse. So I think that behind the scenes, perhaps Michael Gove has been an ally, a friend, and a confidant of Rishi Sunak, potentially. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Michael Gove back in Cabinet.
Going back to what you were saying about Mel Stride and the fact that he might put some people's backs up, though, do you think that the bringing in of people like Michael Gove, who obviously, you know, played such a big role, as you were saying, you know, in trying to, well, some would say trying to knife Liz Truss and trying to get her to reverse on things, how do you think that would be for party unity, though?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think part of the issue around this is that what Michael Gove needs to do is bring the best experienced cabinet ministers to the table in order to try and fix some of the problems, not just in the economy, but in other departments of the government. I mean, this party has been wrestling whether to oust Boris Johnson and then wrestling with who to put back in and then wrestling about whether or not to oust or not Liz Truss from June or May onwards, really. I mean, it's been months that this chaos and this infighting and a party looking inward rather than focusing on governing the country and changing all the people running departments. It's been going on and on for months. And so what Rishi Sunak has to do is he has to steady the ship. He has to get a cabinet of all the different parts of the party in order to try, and I don't know if he succeeds, but try and unify. And he will want also to get experienced cabinet ministers who know what they're doing, that can hit the ground running, back into departments. And that's what I'm expecting to see from this reshuffle. I have to say, his team have been extremely tight-lipped. So everything I'm picking up from the reshuffle is basically, you know, from parliamentary sources and other government sources. But the actual core team are keeping their cards close to the chest. But he obviously would have thought about it. When you run to be leader, you know, you have your key team around them, and they do expect to be rewarded. And it will bring in a new change of guard. I'm really interested to see, though, does he keep any of the key Liz Truss, does he keep, for example, Theresa Coffey, her Deputy Prime Minister, who I think everyone would agree in government, in the parliamentary party, did a really good job as Chief Secretary of State for Department of Work and Pensions during the COVID crisis. You know, there wasn't a big blow-up in the benefits system. It was ferociously difficult to manage that. Rishi Sunak would have worked with her really closely because he was the Chancellor. I know that they came to blows over issues around uprating benefits, over issues about trying to keep that uplift in universal credit. You remember the £20 a week that was so necessary for so many people during the pandemic. You know, they tussled over funding and spending. But I wonder, does he keep Therese Coffey in? You know, is there some sort of offer or signal also to Trussites? That's a question as well.
Interesting stuff. We will, of course, find out later on this afternoon. I think we should be able to have a look now at some pictures that we have got of Rishi Sunak meeting with King Charles. There they are at Buckingham Palace, all smiles, the two men, as they meet. And, of course, King Charles formally invites Rishi Sunak to form a new government. Well, let's bring in our events commentator, Alistair Bruce, shall we? The picture there of them shaking hands.
It is the start of the audience that the King will have given and will have now proceeded probably towards its close. It's quite moving too, the first time that the King receives someone and invites them to form a government. And we remember the photograph quite recently of his mother, the Queen, inviting Rishi Sunak's predecessor not so long ago up at Balmoral. But for the King, a chance to talk, and he always allows the chance of pictures to be taken before the doors are closed, and it would have been behind closed doors that the King, alone with Rishi Sunak, would have invited him to become the head of government and to give him, therefore, as sovereign, the leadership of the executive of the United Kingdom. Photographs now just released.
And Alistair, I'm always so fascinated to know what goes on with these audiences, but they're always so tightly controlled, aren't we? We just get the briefest of statements from the palace, just giving us the facts on what took place with Liz Truss earlier today. But prime ministers really value them, don't they? And I'm sure Rishi Sunak will be no different.
The palace always balances the fact that there is public interest in seeing the meeting of the head of state and the head of government, but also that this is a very private moment. So you have to balance those by getting the photograph at the beginning, and these photographs were clearly taken as the King received Rishi Sunak right after he'd been introduced to him by the King's equerry, Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Thompson. But then, you know, once those doors are closed, and until any Prime Minister breaks the code, we're just not going to know what goes on. We know constitutionally that the King has the right to know what is going on. He has the privilege of being able to give warning or to take advice or even to just in every way interrogate the Prime Minister. But also the Prime Minister has a chance to talk in complete confidence with a sort of avuncular figure of his sovereign. And that relationship is perhaps the only place a Prime Minister can find that kind of confidentiality. So these photographs do mark the beginning of a relationship between head of government with the head of state, the King, which will take its journey forward. And it's going to be such a challenging leadership and premiership by Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. And I'm sure all the way through, the King will be deeply conscious of his constitutional position as head of state and wanting that the progress be done in the most effective way for the benefit of all people who live in the United Kingdom.
And Alistair, you know, just to be really frank with you, I find it quite arresting in some ways seeing King Charles inviting this new Prime Minister in for an audience with him. Of course, his mother met with Liz Truss to one of her very first meetings to appoint her as Prime Minister, and now it is her son who is taking on that role. It must be quite poignant for the new King, not just, of course, because of the huge constitutional moment, but also for the personal moment too.
For the King, remembering too that, you know, moments like when his grandfather, King George VI, in that difficult time in the Second World War, had to choose who to call as Prime Minister between Lord Halifax and Winston Churchill. And it is carrying on that baton through time that goes really back to the start of cabinet government. And of course, King George I, when he arrived in 1714, didn't speak English. And it became more and more necessary for the cabinet to act more and more for the King. In fact, the cabinet room at number 10 Downing Street has one chair around the table with arms, which is the King's chair. And it is that chair that is only given up by Prime Ministers to the King. But when the King is not present, the Prime Minister sits in it. And in a way that again reminds everyone of how it is the King's executive power as sovereign that is being carried out by all those who the Prime Minister nominates to and the King accepts, which we will probably see happen over the next few hours, to be the administration or cabinet and the executive leadership of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Alistair. We, of course, are still looking at those pictures of Buckingham Palace. We are expecting the car to leave carrying Rishi Sunak when he has become the new Prime Minister, or as he has become the new Prime Minister, leaving there and making his way here to Downing Street, where he will address the nation. And of course, those pictures there just released of King Charles meeting with Rishi Sunak. Well, let's bring in Beth Rigby, shall we? Rishi Sunak has become the new Prime Minister. We've seen those pictures of him with Prince Charles, with King Charles, I should say, and the body language between them, all smiles, all handshakes. But now, I guess, it's down to business for the new Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I think we should pause for a moment and just take in what a historic moment this is, because Rishi Sunak is the first British Asian Prime Minister. He's the first Hindu Prime Minister. I think Disraeli was Jewish, but apart from that, I think all Prime Ministers have been Christian by religious denomination. So he's the first Hindu Prime Minister. This is a huge moment for the country. He's also the second youngest ever Prime Minister since William the Pitt the Younger back in the 18th century. So this really is a big moment for the country that we have our first British Asian Prime Minister. And I think that will mean a lot symbolically to a lot of people around the country. So I think it's worth saying that and marking that. In terms of his age, though, and experience, I think it's also fair to say that he has one hell of an in-tray for a guy that is 42, that has only been in politics as a backbencher and then into the Treasury for 7 years. He was, of course, a successful financier. Before that, he worked at a big hedge fund. He did an MBA, a business degree in California, where he met his wife. So he had a very successful career and became very wealthy in his own right before he entered politics. But when he talks about kind of what drives him, he genuinely talks a lot about a sense of his desire to serve the public and public service. He talks about that a lot. What will his style be? Well, as I was saying earlier, you know, when I spoke to some of his team shortly after he was anointed as party leader and therefore Prime Minister, and I said, is he delighted? Was he overjoyed? How did he react? I mean, they really did say that he was, not ecstatic, that he talked about the big responsibility he had now. And I think that will be the style of Rishi Sunak. It will be straight to business. It will be low-key. It will be none of the flourish of Boris Johnson. And I don't think it will be the ideological zeal either of Liz Truss. I think he will try and forge a different path where he tries to get the economy back on track. I mean, he has such a difficult task ahead of him. It would be difficult for any politician right now, given the challenges the country faces. His task has obviously been exacerbated and made more difficult by the decisions of his predecessor. And he not only now has a bigger economic problem on his hands because of the decisions made by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, but he also has a big political problem in terms of a party that is riven with divisions internally, and also a country that does not much like the look of the Conservative Party at the moment. So he's got a kind of triad from policy to politics to the public. He's got a triad of difficulties and challenges that he has to try and grapple. It is a huge job he faces.
Yeah, it really is as well. And it's worth pausing, isn't it, Beth? Because we've been talking about the fact that he is, as you said, the youngest Prime Minister for 200 years. He's had a remarkable rise in Parliament after only being elected as an MP in 2015, only 7 years in Parliament. But at the same time, it's been a pretty bruising few years for him. as the Chancellor, of course, in times of COVID. Then he had that remarkable fallout with Boris Johnson as well. And then the brutal leadership election too, which he lost the first time round earlier this year. So I guess even though he's a relative newcomer in terms of Parliament, how long he's been here, and the fact he's quite young in years compared to other previous prime ministers, it's been quite the ride, hasn't it?
I think being Chancellor during a pandemic where he had to embark on the biggest spending programme that any government had seen since World War II, and then he had so many emergency statements. I mean, it was just incredible to behold. That was a big task he had. But then he did get into hot water, really, politically, because he then had to do the hard work, which was trying to raise taxes in order to start beginning to pay down some of the debt or fund public services. I mean, I think the thing that you can understand about Rishi Sunak's approach to the economy is it is economic orthodoxy, in the sense that this is a Chancellor and now Prime Minister that would want debt falling as a percentage of GDP. He would want to put in fiscal rules. He doesn't want to spend beyond means.
We can go back to Buckingham Palace now, because there's movement at the palace. Alistair, what can you say?
The Prime Minister taking leave there of the King's Private Secretary and former Queen's Private Secretary. Sir Clive and Sir Edward will maintain regular conversations with the Prime Minister. In fact, they probably had a chance to talk after the King appointed his new Prime Minister. There's a lot to do, and the relationship with the palace underscores the fact that whilst head of government, the new Prime Minister will always act on behalf of the United Kingdom and the King. Takes leave of Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Thompson, the equerry, who is always on the King's behalf, the last to say goodbye. And this brief moment of the Constitution playing its part and of the monarch inviting a new Prime Minister to take the helm of the United Kingdom's government is done. And for this Prime Minister, who may have discussed with the King his plans for the government and who will be in and who won't be, and over the next days we will see new ministers and old ministers come to Buckingham Palace in order to both confirm that they hand over their seals of office and also to receive new ones from the King, always underscoring that the constitutional process is observed. But for the palace, a relationship begun, and for the Prime Minister leaving the relative peace and calm of his time with the King and returning out to where quite a crowd has gathered at the North Centre Gate. We saw the King's Lifeguard of the Blues and Royals, who had just dismounted, and we'll hear the reaction. The Prime Minister will return now past the Queen Victoria Memorial, a route that we know from all the great moments of recent times in the nation's story, and he will go the short distance up the Mall and turn right towards number 10 Downing Street. And with the remit from the King of the invitation to form a government, he now must then prove to the King that he can command a majority for his government on the floor of the House of Commons.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed. The constitutional moment, the 57th Prime Minister, the first British Asian Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, making his way from Buckingham Palace now to Downing Street, where he will take up residence as the new Prime Minister. And it's already, of course, been such a busy morning. Liz Truss speaking to King Charles earlier today already feels like ancient history. Now, of course, it was a turn of Rishi Sunak. Those images released by the palace of him shaking hands with King Charles, all smiles, as he was officially invited to form a government. And now making his way, you can see there through London with the motorcade and his car behind, travelling to number 10, where really he faces an enormous in-tray for any Prime Minister. £40 billion black hole, we believe, in the public finances, inflation already so high, and of course a fractious and divided Conservative Party as well. As he makes his way, I do wonder what he's kind of thinking, in the back of that car, perhaps making the finishing touches to his speech that he'll be giving in number 10 Downing Street shortly. Speaking to the country after yesterday, he spoke to his party, and he's just turning down now, it looks like, onto Whitehall, just moments away from Downing Street. And Beth, we can... the gates of Downing Street now opening. You can see the policemen there waving in the car. So we really are just moments away now from seeing the new Prime Minister arriving. And just on cue, Larry the cat exiting the door of number 10. Incredible timing there from Larry. And here we are. The car now turning into Downing Street. You can see there crowds of people heckling the new Prime Minister. Some things never change. And that car now pulling up into Downing Street. The gates are now closed. And we should get the first glimpse of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister as he leaves the car. Chancellor, of course, under Boris Johnson, he resigned. Now, second time running, he won the Conservative leadership contest and is now the new Prime Minister.
Good morning. I've just been to Buckingham Palace and accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government in his name. It is only right to explain why I'm standing here as your new Prime Minister. Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis. The aftermath of COVID still lingers. Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets and supply chains the world over. I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made. Not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. But mistakes nonetheless. And I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately. I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come. But you saw me during COVID doing everything I could to protect people and businesses with schemes like furlough. There are always limits, more so now than ever. But I promise you this: I will bring that same compassion to the challenges we face today. The government I lead will not leave the next generation, your children and grandchildren, with a debt to settle that we were too weak to pay ourselves. I will unite our country, not with words, but with action. I will work day in and day out to deliver for you. This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level. Trust is earned, and I will earn yours. I will always be grateful to Boris Johnson for his incredible achievements as Prime Minister, and I treasure his warmth and generosity of spirit. And I know he would agree that the mandate my party earned in 2019 is not the sole property of any one individual. It is a mandate that belongs to and unites all of us. And the heart of that mandate is our manifesto. I will deliver on its promise: a stronger NHS, better schools, safer streets, control of our borders, protecting our environment, supporting our armed forces, levelling up, and building an economy that embraces the opportunities of Brexit, where businesses invest, innovate, and create jobs. I understand how difficult this moment is. After the billions of pounds it cost us to combat COVID, after all the dislocation that caused, in the midst of a terrible war that must be seen successfully to its conclusions, I fully appreciate how hard things are. And I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened. All I can say is that I am not daunted. I know the high office I have accepted, and I hope to live up to its demands. But when the opportunity to serve comes along, you cannot question the moment, only your willingness. So I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future, to put your needs above politics, to reach out and build a government that represents the very best traditions of my party. Together, we can achieve incredible things. We will create a future worthy of the sacrifices so many have made, and fill tomorrow and every day thereafter with hope. Thank you.
Rishi Sunak? Can you unite the party, Prime Minister?
Rishi Sunak there, the new Prime Minister, posing for a few photos after making his speech on the steps of Downing Street. It was a speech directed at the public. I will work day in, day out for you. But he also had a few words to say about his predecessor, that Liz Truss had a noble aim to improve growth, but some mistakes were made. I've been elected to fix them. And you can hear the applause as he enters number 10 as Prime Minister. Beth.
That's his team inside, and you can hear them as he goes in. They all line up as you go in, and I'm sure we'll get pictures later of him being ushered in with the new team and a new start for number 10. Again, the second Prime Minister to have been appointed by the Conservative Party without an election, as many opposition politicians are pointing out, in a space of just 7 weeks. But look, what was that speech about? I think the first thing to say is he said what Liz Truss did not. The first thing he said was mistakes were made. It wasn't from ill will. I respect her restlessness to get things done, but mistakes were made, and I was partly elected to fix them, or appointed to fix them. So that was the first thing he said. He acknowledged to the public the mistakes, and he also acknowledged that he, as the new Prime Minister, had work to do to restore trust of the British people. So I think that was the first key point, acknowledging what Liz Truss wouldn't, laying it straight with the British people as well. He then, the second sort of section of that speech was what is my agenda? And he was absolutely crystal clear about that. It was about putting, in his words, economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. So there he was saying, I understand the economic turmoil we have created or helped create by these bad decisions, these mistakes. I will try and put it right. But then there was some levelling with the public as well. He said that will mean that difficult decisions have to come. And that, of course, is a nod to that all-important fiscal statement, the tax and spend policies. He then, and I think this was an attempt to distance from Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and the chaos that both of them in different ways brought upon Downing Street and Parliament. He spoke about uniting with words, not with actions, not words. He also spoke, and this was critical, I thought, in terms of him trying to put clear blue water between himself and predecessors, about integrity, professionalism, and I can't remember the third one actually, but integrity and professionalism. And he said that he's going to get on with the job, and that is integrity, accountability and professionalism are the three watchwords of his government. Then there was stuff about unification, because he talked about Liz Truss in quite warm terms before he criticised her, saying, I admired her restlessness, I appreciated what she was trying to do. He then went on to talk about Boris Johnson. He said he was grateful to him for his incredible achievements, and his warmth and generosity of spirit was something people treasured.
Just to mark that we're now at 12 o'clock. We are here in Downing Street. I'm with Beth Rigby, and we are digesting the Rishi Sunak statement. Beth.
Yeah, as I was saying, so he was talking about Boris Johnson. He, in praising Boris Johnson is an attempt to put an olive branch out, really, I think, to those who were Johnsonites that are very unhappy about a Rishi Sunak government. And then in terms of the party and trying to unite the party, he talked about the manifesto, saying that that was the mandate on which he would now run the government. There was no new agenda for Rishi Sunak beyond that reiteration of committing to trying to get back to a position of economic stability. It was rather about delivering on the manifesto. And then the final element of what I think was a very well-constructed speech, actually, was Rishi the man, if you like, Rishi Sunak the man. And this is where, as I was saying earlier, this idea of public service came to the fore. He said, again, I want to restore trust after all that's happened. He said, I'm not daunted. I appreciate how hard things are, a message to the public, like he understands the difficulties people are having. He said, when the opportunity to serve comes, you cannot question the moment. He said, I stand ready, and I thought this was a really key line, to put your needs above politics. And what is that? That's a nod to the fact he understands, as does the Parliamentary Party, that the public are sick and tired of these endless Tory wars that have brought down 2 prime ministers in 3 months and brought all this political and economic turbulence. And there he says, I want to put your needs as the public above politics and reach out to represent the best traditions of my party. He said that he wants to fill tomorrow with hope, and with that he went in. So I think, what are the elements? Acknowledging the mistakes, trying to reach out to rivals, praising Boris Johnson, economic stability at the heart of government, won't go beyond the terms that they had with the British public that elected them in 2019, and then a message that I am not Boris Johnson, I am not Liz Truss, I am a different leader, and I will put accountability and integrity and professionalism at the heart of my government. So that is the Rishi Sunak pitch to voters and the party. Let's see how it goes.
And like you say, a direct pitch there to voters as well, what perhaps we've been lacking from him in the last week or so, talking about putting their needs first. Just looking at some of the details of the speech, Beth, I kind of wonder if what we're going to be talking about in the weeks to come is the section on economic stability that you were talking about, the difficult decisions to come. You know, he was talking, wasn't he, about he wouldn't be a Prime Minister to put debt onto your children and grandchildren that we were too weak to pay off. I mean, is that the crux of it, really?
That is the crux. Rishi Sunak is a chancellor like, you know, Sajid Javid before him and George Osborne before him, and Philip Hammond before him, or between him and Osborne. This is a sort of tradition of Conservative chancellors, which is fiscal rules. And actually, for decades, or well, many years, that's how the Treasury has been run. There's a set of fiscal rules, and you set your fiscal framework, and you instruct the markets about, you know, how you intend to pay down debt, on what period, and how you're going to borrow money. And that's the framework within which you do your business, in which you make your tax and spend policies. And all Rishi Sunak's really going back to is kind of Treasury orthodoxy, if you like, which is, I don't want to laden our grandchildren with debt by borrowing to fund tax cuts, as Liz Truss did, in order to boost growth. That was her argument, that you would boost growth, the tax revenue would therefore go up because the economy's growing, you get a trickle-down effect. Rishi Sunak is signalling that he's going to go back to a more traditional way of running the economy, which is clearly what the markets want, because when Boris Johnson revealed that he was withdrawing from the race at the weekend, you know, all the market response was positive. The markets like Rishi Sunak, and they like Jeremy Hunt in the Treasury and Rishi Sunak in as Prime Minister. So I think that, well, that's the signal so far. I should caution, because let's see what they do. But I think that the key thing of this is that he wants to put economic credibility at the heart of the government, but he was also clear that involves difficult decisions. And this is where, if you like, the rubber hits the road, because then what he has to do is he has to make tax and spend decisions. As I was saying earlier, there could be a multi-billion, tens of billions of pounds of a fiscal black hole, the gap between your tax commitments and your spending commitments. And how do you fill that, and how do you signal to the market that you can begin to pay down this mountain of debt that was built up during COVID and is now building up again even more because of the need to fund and support energy bills. So these are really, really, really intractable decisions and difficult decisions for any Chancellor and Prime Minister, and he has to take that on. And when he does take that on, that could be very difficult with the Parliamentary Party and the public. Yeah, he said he wanted to show compassion. Well, that is going to be hard, as you say, at the time when he's also putting fiscal responsibility at the heart of government. Let's just bring in a quick tweet, shall we? Because Boris Johnson has just tweeted to say congratulations to Rishi Sunak on this historic day. This is the moment for every Conservative to give our new Prime Minister their full and wholehearted support. And this is, of course, key, because Boris Johnson and what happens, most importantly, to his supporters in Parliament could be absolutely critical to whether or not Rishi Sunak does manage to achieve the unity that he hopes to. Beth, you were talking earlier, weren't you, about the kind of praise to Boris Johnson in the speech, but I did think you were right to point out that perhaps the line about bringing back integrity was a bit of a dig at the former Prime Minister as well. How difficult do you think it will be for him to bring those Johnsonites, if you like, back into the fold? Well, that's the big question. I mean, that is the question in terms of the political management of the party. that I think will be something that will be very live, and we will be watching very carefully. The couple of things I would say about that was that on the face of it yesterday, after Boris Johnson withdrew from the race on Sunday night, there were very public backers of Boris Johnson, such as Priti Patel, James Cleverly, Nadeem Zahawi, that then folded into the Rishi Sunak camp and said that they would serve him. But the Boris Johnson "I'm not standing" statement was like the most Boris Johnson type of statement you could ever imagine. In that, he said, I could if I wanted to, but actually the party don't want me to, and Rishi and Penny won't do deals with me, so I've got no option but to not go for it. So it wasn't done it was done in a way that was quite agitating, I would say. And some of his supporters will have read that. And, Nadine Dorry is one of his key backers, already saying, there should be a general election rather than saying rather that Boris Johnson's the only one really with the mandate because he won the general election. And I wonder, at the moment, many Boris Johnson backers that I wanted to speak to today or asked to come on camera, they just wanted to keep out of it because I think there is a sort of tradition, if you like, or convention, that if your person wins and you're on the losing side, you bow out for a bit, you give them a bit of space, you allow them to have a go. You have what is described as a honeymoon period. I mean, that is typically what happens when someone becomes the new Prime Minister. Now, in the case of Liz Truss, the honeymoon period didn't happen because the policies that she introduced so rapidly created this massive backlash in the markets, and then what flowed. But I think for Rishi Sunak, I think that there is a party that is wearied and bloodied. I think maybe that they want a period of calm. I think he might be given some space. But I say all of that, Sophie, with the caution that next Monday, if this fiscal statement goes ahead as is planned, they will want to do it on October the 31st. The reason is the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England will set interest rates on November the 2nd, right? And what they do with interest rates, which has a massive impact on all of us, that could be partly affected by the decisions the government make ahead of it, right? So I don't see that statement moving from October the 31st, so I see it happening before November the 2nd. And at that point, if Rishi Sunak really does set out the tax and spend envelopes, and he makes decisions on how to uprate benefits, is it in line with inflation or is it in line with earnings? Obviously, if it's in line with earnings, people on benefits are taking a pay cut. And I should say that 42% of recipients of universal credit are working families. This sort of notion that it's people that don't work or people that have disabilities or they're on for reasons they can't work, that's not entirely true. So these are people that are often working and they're just in low-paid jobs and they're struggling to make ends meet. So there's a big push in the party to uprate with inflation. There was a big push as well to stick to the triple lock, as you remember. That's when you lift pensions by wages, earnings or inflation, depending on which is highest. Well, inflation, Liz Truss committed to doing that last week in the Commons, facing a backlash. It cost £5.6 billion, just like that, OK? These are massive decisions. There's a massive impact on the public finances, and he has to lay all of that out. And I think whether it's Rishi Sunak, whether it's Liz Truss, whether it's Boris Johnson, whether it's Jeremy Hunt, whether it's Penny Mordaunt, these are extremely, extremely difficult decisions. And he did say there it's going to be difficult. But the goodwill of the British people with this government at the moment is pretty much dried up. There is not much of a well of sympathy or tolerance, I would say. And then there's going to be these series of very difficult decisions to take. So it could be very, very bumpy for him very, very quickly.
Bumpy for him and also bumpy for the rest of the country as well. Beth, thank you very much indeed for your analysis this morning. Beth Ridley there, our political editor. Well, it's been two very different speeches this morning from Liz Truss, who was standing by her pro-growth, low-tax economic plan. And then, of course, we've just heard from the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Mistakes were made. It's his job to fix them. Well, we're joined now by the Conservative MP, Philip Dunn. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning, Mr Dunn. Well, it was pretty blunt, wasn't it, from Rishi Sunak? Some mistakes were made. I've been elected to fix them, and that begins immediately. Is he right?
Well, I think that was a characteristically impressive performance from the new Prime Minister, and he was focusing on the need for his government to show integrity, accountability and professionalism. And I think that will characterise his approach to the very difficult challenges that we've got ahead, as Beth was just outlining there.
You were right to say that they are difficult challenges ahead. He acknowledges that in the speech. He talks about difficult decisions to come, that he wants to bring back economic stability, that he doesn't want to pass a debt burden or too high a debt burden onto our children and grandchildren. But he also says he wants to show compassion. How on earth do you do those two things at once?
Well, there's going to be measures, as we've already seen, the energy cost, the price guarantee to help people cope with their energy costs. We've said
but that's been cut back, hasn't it? Shortened.
Well, we've said that will be reviewed for the next phase. So the first 6 months is clear, and in that review, he'll be focusing on helping the most vulnerable the most. So I think that will characterise the way in which the decisions that he takes are implemented, that they'll be there to help those who need it most.
He also spoke about wanting to bring forward the best of the Conservative Party. So, in other words, bringing in a cabinet of all the talents, perhaps a bit of a nod to there being jobs for people who didn't necessarily back him in the leadership race. What would you like to see from the new cabinet?
Well, I'd like to see a spread across the party in senior positions in government, using people who've got established talent as well as bringing on some new talent. So one of the challenges that the previous Prime Minister had is that her cabinet was almost entirely made up of those who had been loyal to her in the vote during the summer. And I think this Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has the space now to be able to appoint by talent rather than by loyalty.
Do you think that he will do that then?
You need to ask him whether he will do it or not. My expectation is that that's exactly what he will do. He's got some we don't know yet whether Jeremy Hunt will remain in post as Chancellor, but I would expect that to be the case. And I would imagine that there will be senior roles for Penny Mordaunt and others who were in Boris Johnson's cabinet, as well as Liz Truss's cabinet, as well as people who are currently on the backbenches.
It'll be interesting to see. I have to say, if only I could ask Rishi Sunak directly who would be in his cabinet, that's definitely something I would be taking advantage of right now. Just to reflect on the Liz Truss speech, she was talking about how she acted urgently and decisively, that she was on the side of hardworking people, and then really, I guess, digging into her plan for low growth and lower taxes as well. Do you think that comes across as a bit tone-deaf, I guess, to a country who are grappling with high mortgage rates, where the Bank of England had to step in to stop and run on pensions?
Well, I think, Liz Truss has got she's been through a very difficult few weeks. It's not surprising to me that she's sort of emphasising what she was trying to do, which was to inject dynamism into the economy. And the problem was she was doing it at too fast a pace without having laid the groundwork in advance. So I'm not surprised that she said the words that she did. I think what is very encouraging is we've just seen the statement which you put up a few moments ago from Boris Johnson expressing his full support for Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister and encouraging colleagues to get behind him. And certainly the mood in the Conservative Party in Westminster last night and this morning is very powerfully that we've gone through a difficult period, we are putting it behind us, we're looking forward and in a united way.
And that is the key, isn't it? Whether or not the Conservative Party can unite. Rishi Sunak said yesterday that the choice for Conservative MPs was unite or die. Do you think he was right?
Well, I think we have to unite. We've gone through a relatively prolonged one prolonged and then one very short leadership contest over the course of the last 2 to 3 months, and that's been seen by the country as somewhat self-indulgent. I think now what we have to absolutely focus on is making the difficult decisions, getting fiscal stability back into the markets, and getting confidence of the country that the Conservatives are the best people to continue to govern the country.
Well, that certainly
we can only do that if we're united.
absolutely right there. We'll wait to see whether or not the Conservative Party can unite for more than a few hours, at least, behind the new Prime Minister. Thank you very much for being on the programme.
Sophie.
OK, there you go. Well, it has been a busy morning here in Westminster. Liz Truss, the outgoing Prime Minister, giving her speech on the steps of Downing Street here with her husband and daughters behind her, very much saying that her plan for growth was the right one. And then, of course, moments later, or an hour later or so, Rishi Sunak saying mistakes were made. So two very different speeches in tone. Now, he has just made a speech in Downing Street. He warned as well that difficult decisions would have to be made as the country faces what he called a profound economic crisis. Well, the formal start of Rishi Sunak's term in office began with an audience with King Charles that was late this morning, where he was invited to form a new administration. A little earlier, the King had accepted the resignation of Liz Truss just 49 days after she'd been invited to form a government by the late Queen Elizabeth.
Good morning. I've just been to Buckingham Palace and accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government in his name. It is only right to explain why I'm standing here as your new Prime Minister. Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis. The aftermath of COVID still lingers. Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets and supply chains the world over. I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made. Not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. But mistakes nonetheless. And I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately. I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come. But you saw me during COVID doing everything I could to protect people and businesses with schemes like furlough. There are always limits, more so now than ever. But I promise you this: I will bring that same compassion to the challenges we face today. The government I lead will not leave the next generation, your children and grandchildren, with a debt to settle that we were too weak to pay ourselves. I will unite our country, not with words, but with action. I will work day in and day out to deliver for you. This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level. Trust is earned, and I will earn yours. I will always be grateful to Boris Johnson for his incredible achievements as Prime Minister, and I treasure his warmth and generosity of spirit. And I know he would agree that the mandate my party earned in 2019 is not the sole property of any one individual. It is a mandate that belongs to and unites all of us. And the heart of that mandate is our manifesto. I will deliver on its promise: a stronger NHS, better schools, safer streets, control of our borders, protecting our environment, supporting our armed forces, levelling up and building an economy that embraces the opportunities of Brexit, where businesses invest, innovate and create jobs. I understand how difficult this moment is. After the billions of pounds it cost us to combat COVID, after all the dislocation that caused, in the midst of a terrible war that must be seen successfully to its conclusions, I fully appreciate how hard things are. And I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened. All I can say is that I am not daunted. I know the high office I have accepted, and I hope to live up to its demands. But when the opportunity to serve comes along, you cannot question the moment, only your willingness. So I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future, to put your needs above politics, to reach out and build a government that represents the very best traditions of my party. Together, we can achieve incredible things. We will create a future worthy of the sacrifices so many have made, and fill tomorrow and every day thereafter with hope. Thank you.
Well, that was Rishi Sunak's first speech as Prime Minister, warning of difficult decisions to come, pledging to put economic credibility at the heart of his administration. And did have a few tough words for his predecessor, saying some mistakes were made, I've been elected to fix them. Well, earlier, Liz Truss delivered her final speech as Prime Minister, and it was pretty different in tone.
I wish Rishi Sunak every success for the good of our country. I want to thank Hugh, Francis, Liberty, my family and friends, and all the team at Number 10 for their love, friendship and support. I also want to thank my protection team. I look forward to spending more time in my constituency and continuing to serve South West Norfolk from the backbenches. Our country continues to battle through a storm. But I believe in Britain. I believe in the British people. And I know that brighter days lie ahead. Thank you.
Liz Truss there pledging to continue as an MP from the backbenches and one of a few ex-Prime Ministers in Parliament as she walked away from Downing Street for the last time with her husband and her two daughters. She was then driven away from Downing Street to make the short journey to Buckingham Palace for that appointment with King Charles to hand in her resignation. And around 20 minutes ago, the new Prime Minister entered Number 10 to the cheers of his new staff waiting for him behind closed doors. Well, joining us now to discuss what a Rishi Sunak premiership means is the chair of the Labour Party, Anneliese Dodds. Well, we know that he's going to be a very different Prime Minister to Liz Truss. That much was evident by the two speeches that they gave this morning on Downing Street. Do you think he could be a bit more formidable opposition to Labour?
Well, unfortunately, Rishi Sunak has been at the heart of all of the Conservative failures that we've seen, quite frankly, including the apogee that we saw recently with Liz Truss. I mean, if the problem overall is the Conservative Party, then the answer cannot be Rishi Sunak. he doesn't have a mandate to be crowned in this manner. We've seen, 3 prime ministers now in just 5 months. The country did not ask for this chaos, and really we need a fresh start now. We do need to see a general election for the genuine change that people need.
Is it really fair to pin the Liz Truss issues on Rishi Sunak, though? I mean, in the last leadership election, he spent his whole time basically arguing against her economic policy. He said it was fantasy economics, and he's done absolutely zero to support her in the last month.
But we saw a cost of living crisis in our country before the recent period of chaos under Liz Truss. We saw the creation of that high-tax, low-growth economy under the Conservatives being built up over the last 12 years of Conservative-led governments. And I'm afraid Rishi Sunak was at the heart of those developments. Nobody voted for that high-tax, low-growth economy when they voted Conservative in the 2019 election. And, again, Rishi Sunak said in his speech that he wanted, for example, to focus on levelling up. Well, we know that as Chancellor, he made clear he actively stopped measures to enable funds being received by those areas that need them. So, really, he does not have a mandate to simply be crowned in this way. We do need to see a fresh start.
You talked there about the high tax, low growth of the Conservative Party, with the emphasis on high tax. Would you like to see lower taxes now then?
Well, Labour's been very clear that we want to spend wisely and tax fairly. We've consistently...
Sorry, I'm just going to come in. I'm just going to come in there. I'm just coming because everyone would say they want to spend wisely and tax fairly. It's quite meaningless, really. Would you like to see lower taxes now?
Well, it's not meaningless when we've set out which taxes we would remove and where we would remove tax loopholes, and you can contrast those actually with Rishi Sunak's record. We've been very clear that we would remove those loopholes for non-DOMs, which mean that they pay far less tax than people who live here and pay taxes in the ordinary way. We would do that so that we could pay for more nurses and more doctors in our NHS. For example, we've also said that, for example, we would get rid of some of those tax breaks for property developers. Labour has been clear that we do not want to see a high level of taxation on working people when there are alternatives that government could take. Again, we see under the Conservatives a complete unwillingness, and in fact Rishi Sunak again was part of this, an unwillingness to use some of the super profits from oil and gas companies to get people's bills down. Eventually, Rishi Sunak putting that into practice, but full ultimately of loopholes when he did adopt a windfall tax. So Labour would take very different approaches to taxation to the choices that have been made by Conservatives. Labour's on the side of working people. I'm afraid we have not seen that from the Conservatives, and that includes Rishi Sunak.
Do you think that Rishi Sunak will be a better Prime Minister than Liz Truss?
Well, I'm afraid the Conservatives can move around the person at the top of their party, but they're still the same Conservatives. And we didn't hear from Sunak in his speech any clear indication, in particular of a plan for growth. Labour set out very clearly what we would be doing now to ensure growth in our green prosperity plan, that 2030 energy decarbonisation plan, for example, getting rid of business rates, replacing them with a fairer tax, and so on. We didn't hear any of that kind of content from Rishi Sunak just now. So I don't see that there will be that change, I'm afraid, that our country needs.
What I don't understand is, you're saying that there's no change between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, but then you're criticising him for not putting growth at the heart of his speech. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? That he's trying to do something differently to Liz Truss, who was all about growth. He's about trying to bring down the debt burden, about trying to get the kind of, the fiscal things back on track with difficult decisions on tax and spending. I mean, that's the difference, isn't it?
Well, no. I mean, ultimately, Truss's approach to growth was to say that it's created by some kind of trickle-down, that if you make the wealthiest even more wealthy and profitable companies even more profitable, that will automatically create growth. It didn't. But actually, we've seen under Rishi Sunak an unwillingness to really grip onto some of the very same issues. I just talked about the non-dom tax system, where Sunak refused to get rid of that system. That benefits some of the very best off people in our country. Well, he also hasn't been acting to ensure that we really have a proper plan for growth. That's what's needed for our country. Labour set out those concrete measures. We've done so early. We've said that we would be, as I mentioned before, decarbonising our energy supply. That would give us energy security, it would get people's bills down, and it would create jobs up and down the country. We haven't seen anything like that, either under Liz Truss nor indeed now, I'm afraid, under Rishi Sunak. But it's what's needed for our country. And it's not just me as a Labour politician saying that. We've also heard from the head of Tesco, him saying that it's only Labour who are on the park when it comes to that genuine commitment to delivering a plan for growth.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Labour's Annalise Dodds there talking about Labour's alternative plan for growth and giving her reaction to Rishi Sunak. Well, we are expecting Rishi Sunak to announce his new cabinet later this afternoon. It's going to be one of the biggest clues as to what a new administration is likely to look like. He's talked about bringing the best of the party to the fore. So there is perhaps a hint and a suggestion that he might be trying to bring in talent from all sides of the party, including those he didn't